Black snow over Bremen December 20th, 1943. The sky over England was the color of dull steel, the kind of grey that promised nothing good. Frost clung to the wings of the B-17 Flying Fortress parked on the runway, its metal skin already aching from the cold. Painted on the nose, in faded white letters, was a name that sounded more like a joke than a war machine. Ye Old Pub. Inside the cockpit, Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown sat perfectly still, hands resting on the controls, listening to the engines warm up, at 21 years old. He was the youngest man on the aircraft, and today was his first combat mission. Not his first flight, not his first training run, his first real mission over enemy territory, with live flak, live fighters, and no second chances. Behind him were 9 other men. Each one carried his own fear, folded neatly under discipline and routine. They had trained for months together. They had memorized procedures, emergency drills, gun jams, oxygen failures. None of that training explained how it would feel when people were actively trying to kill them. The briefing that morning had been blunt. Target, Bremen, Germany. Altitude, 25,000 feet. Threat level, extreme. Bremen was one of the most heavily defended cities in Nazi Germany. It housed vital aircraft factories, submarine yards, and industrial targets the Allies desperately wanted destroyed. It was protected by layers of anti-aircraft artillery and swarms of German fighters that knew the sky like their own backyard. Everyone in the room understood what Bremen meant: losses. When the engines roared to life and the B-17 began rolling down the runway, Charlie Brown pushed those thoughts away. He had a job to do. That was the only thing that mattered now. The aircraft lifted off the frozen ground and climbed into the clouds, joining hundreds of other bombers assembling into massive formations over England. From a distance, it looked almost beautiful. A sky full of silver wings. But beauty didn't survive long at 25,000 feet. As the formation crossed the North Sea and approached the German coast, the temperature inside Ye Old Pub dropped sharply. Frost formed along the inside of the fuselage. Oxygen masks snapped into place. Conversation faded into short, clipped words over the intercom. Everyone was alert now. Germany appeared below them like a dark scar across the earth. And then the flak started. At first, it came as distant black puffs, far enough away to seem harmless. Charlie had been told not to focus on them. Don't stare, don't flinch, just fly straight and level. Let the bombardier do his job. But the puffs grew closer, then closer still. The aircraft shook violently as an explosion rocked the left wing. Metal screamed. Warning lights flickered. The sound was unlike anything Charlie had ever heard. Part thunder, part tearing steel, flak. Heavy flak, someone shouted over the intercom. The sky filled with black bursts, thick and relentless, like someone was tearing holes in the air around them. Each explosion threw shrapnel in every direction, shards of hot steel designed to rip through aluminum and flesh alike. A shell exploded directly in front of the nose. The cockpit windows shattered. Glass flew everywhere. The bombardier was hit instantly. There was no scream, no warning, just sudden, violent silence where a man had been seconds earlier. Blood splattered across the instruments and froze almost immediately in the thin, cold air. Charlie Brown barely had time to process it. Another explosion rocked the tail. The aircraft lurched downward, dropping out of formation. That was when everything started to go wrong at once. The intercom crackled and went dead. Oxygen pressure dropped. The plane shuddered as pieces of it were torn away. Somewhere behind him, a gun stopped firing. Then another, German fighters appeared like dark insects against the pale sky, Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs. They came fast, diving through the bomber stream, firing cannons and machine guns, tearing into the formations with ruthless precision. Bombers exploded in midair, breaking apart in sheets of flame and falling toward the earth in pieces. Charlie watched one B-17 take a direct hit in the wing. It rolled violently, then vanished in a fireball. Parachutes blossomed in the distance. Some never opened. Ye old pub was hit again. The aircraft groaned, metal bending in ways it was never meant to bend. The control column went slack for a terrifying moment before responding again. Warning lights lit up the panel like a Christmas tree. The bald turret gunner reported his guns. We're out. The top turret jammed. The tail gunner was wounded. Blood ran along the floor and froze. In place, the bomber dropped further, slipping below the protection of the formation. That was the death zone. Lone bombers were easy prey. German pilots waited for this exact moment. Charlie Brown tightened his grip on the controls. He could feel fear now, real fear pressing against his chest. Not panic. Not yet. Just the heavy understanding that the odds had turned sharply against them. They reached the bomb run. Despite the damage, despite the chaos, the bombardier's replacement crawled forward, fighting pain and fear, and took position. The aircraft flew straight and level through the flak, just as it had been trained to do. Bombs away. The plane leapt upward as the payload dropped, suddenly lighter. For a brief moment, Charlie allowed himself to think they might make it out. Then a flak shell exploded directly beneath the cockpit. The nose was torn open. Wine screamed into the aircraft, ripping at everything loose. The temperature dropped even further. Instruments failed. The oxygen system was damaged. The co-pilot was wounded. The navigator was bleeding. The aircraft was no longer combat-capable. And the German fighters knew it. They attacked from behind, from above. From the sides, cannon shells punched through the fuselage. Holes opened everywhere. The B-17 was riddled, shredded, barely holding together through momentum and stubborn engineering. One by one, the guns fell silent. Charlie glanced at the fuel gauges. One tank was leaking badly. Another wasn't responding at all. All pressure was dropping. The engines coughed, sputtered. Then steadied for now. They were flying a crippled bomber. Deep inside Germany, alone. Over the intercom, someone asked the question no one wanted to hear. "Lieutenant, should we bail out?" Charlie swallowed. He looked at the sky around them, at the enemy fighters circling like wolves, at the damage reports coming in faster than he could process them. He knew what happened to parachuting airmen over Germany. He had heard the stories. "No," he said. Finally, not yet. The truth was simple. If they bailed out now, they'd be captured or worse. If they stayed with the plane, they might still make it to the coast. It wasn't much of a plan. It was the only one they had, as the old pub limped northward, descending steadily. The German fighters pulled back for a moment. Charlie didn't understand why. Maybe they were regrouping. Maybe they were waiting for reinforcements. Maybe they were just playing with them. The aircraft dropped below 20,000 feet, then 15,000. Below them, Germany stretched out in sharp detail fields, towns, rivers, roads. It felt wrong to be this slow, this exposed, inside the bomber. The crew worked silently. They tended to the wounded, tried to stop bleeding with frozen fingers, checked systems that barely responded. No one spoke more than necessary. They all understood. Something now. This was no longer about the mission. This was about survival. As they crossed over the countryside near Bremen, a lone German fighter lifted off from an airfield below. Its pilot was Oberleutnant Franz Stigler. Stigler had already scored numerous victories. He was respected, disciplined, and dangerously skilled. On that day, he was 1 kill away from earning the Knight S Cross, one of Nazi Germany's highest military honors, when the alarm sounded and he scrambled to his aircraft. Stigler expected another routine intercept, another bomber, another enemy, another kill. That was how the war worked. He climbed fast, engine roaring, eyes scanning the sky. Then he saw it. A lone B-17, flying low, trailing smoke, riddled with holes. An easy kill. Stigler moved in behind the bomber, lining up his guns, closing the distance. His finger rested on the trigger. At this range, he couldn't miss. But as he drew closer, something stopped him. He could see inside the aircraft. He could see wounded men dot blood, a shattered nose, guns that didn't move. This was no longer a fighting machine. It was a flying wreck, and inside it were human beings. Franz Stigler hesitated. Behind him was the Lord of War as he had been taught it by the Luftwaffe. Ahead of him was the reality of what he was about to do. He remembered something his commanding officer had told him early in the war. You fight with honor, or you don't fight at all. If I ever see you shoot a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. Stigler was not looking at a victory. He was looking at a massacre. Inside ye old pub, Charlie Brown noticed the fighter sliding into position behind them. He felt the aircraft tense, as if it knew what was coming. He waited for the impact, for the bullets, for the end. But nothing happened. The German fighter stayed there close, too close. Charlie glanced over his shoulder and froze. The enemy pilot was close enough to see clearly. So close Charlie could see the outline of his helmet, the shape of his goggles. They locked eyes. For a moment that seemed to stretch far longer than it should have, two enemies stared at each other through cold glass and frozen air. One had every reason to kill. The other had no way to fight back. And in that moment, the war paused, high above Germany. Amid smoke, blood, and broken metal, Franz Stigler made a decision that would follow him for the rest of his life. He did not fire. The hunter takes aim ***. Franz Stigler had made this climb hundreds of times. The engine of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 howled as it clawed for altitude. The aircraft responding like an extension of his own body. He knew every vibration, every sound, every subtle change in pitch. Flying was not something he did. It was something he was. Below him, Germany stretched out in winter colors, grey fields, thin rivers, towns wrapped in smoke from factories still running despite the bombing. Above him, contrails cut the sky into long white scars. Marking where the war had passed only minutes before, the radio crackled with reports, enemy. Bombers damaged, stragglers heading north, opportunities. Stigler acknowledged without speaking. His focus was already locked on the horizon. He had 22 confirmed kills. One more would likely earn him the Knight's Cross. Not that he thought about medals much anymore, early in the war. Maybe, back when victories felt clean, back when targets were distant silhouettes and not burning. Aircraft spilling men into the sky. Now, kills came with faces. He spotted the bomber almost immediately. It was flying low to low, a B-17 flying fortress, separated from its formation, trailing smoke like a wounded animal. Its silver skin was torn open, peppered with black holes. One engine sputtered, coughing unevenly. The tail sagged slightly. Struggling to hold altitude, Stigler narrowed his eyes. This wasn't a trap. This was a gift. He moved into position behind the bomber, the sun at his back. Just as he had been trained, the distance closed rapidly. At this range, his 20mm cannons would tear the aircraft apart in seconds. One burst into the wings, another into the cockpit, clean, efficient. He thumbed the safety off. And then he saw inside. Through the shattered tail section, Stigler could see movement not frantic, not defensive. Just slow, labored motion, a man slumped over, another crawling. Blood smeared along the interior of the fuselage. Dark against the frost, the rear guns didn't move. The tail gunner should have been firing by now. He wasn't. Stigler eased closer, disbelief replacing adrenaline. The bomber wasn't maneuvering. It wasn't trying to escape. It was barely flying at all. He could see straight through the nose. The glass was gone. The bombardier's position was empty or worse. Stigler felt something tighten. In his chest, this wasn't combat anymore. This was execution. Inside ye old pub. Charlie Brown braced himself. Every second stretched painfully long. He waited for the impact, for the violent tearing sound of cannon shells ripping through the cockpit. He had seen it happen to other planes. He knew what it looked like when a B-17 died. But the bullets didn't come. The German fighter stayed with them, matching speed, matching altitude, hanging just off the left wing now. Charlie turned his head slightly and looked. The enemy pilot was close enough to read his expression. He didn't look triumphant. He looked conflicted. Charlie's heart pounded. His hands were slick with sweat inside his gloves. Every instinct screamed at him to dive, to turn, to do something. But the aircraft barely responded to his inputs. Any sudden movement might tear it apart. So he held steady. He flew straight. The German pilot raised one hand. Not toward his guns. Toward Charlie. For a moment, Charlie didn't understand. His mind rejected the image outright. Enemy pilots didn't wave. They killed. But the hand stayed raised. Not a salute. Not a threat. A warning. Stigler pointed toward the coast, toward the north, toward freedom. Then he shook his head slowly, deliberately, as if to say, "Don't try anything stupid." Charlie Brown stared back, stunned. Inside the German fighter, Franz Stigler made his decision. He thought of his brother, August, killed earlier in the war, shot down without mercy. He thought of his commanding officer's words about honor, about never shooting helpless men. He thought of the oath he had taken, not to a regime, but to a profession. Pilot to pilot, war or no war, he slid his aircraft into position alongside the bomber, close enough that Allied gunners, if any were still alive, could have killed him instantly. They didn't. There were no guns left. Stigler stayed there anyway. He knew the risk. German anti-aircraft. Batteries below might mistake him for escorting the enemy. Other fighters might report him. If he was caught, this would not end with a reprimand. It would end with a firing squad. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the men inside that aircraft for several minutes. The two planes flew together in silence, an impossible pairing against the winter sky below them. German flak positions tracked the bomber, adjusting aim. Stigler subtly adjusted his own position, flying between the guns and the wounded B-17. He waggled his wings slightly, a signal, "Stay close, inside ye old pub." The crew slowly realized something extraordinary was happening. "He's not firing," someone said. Disbelief thick in his voice. Charlie didn't answer. He was afraid that speaking might break. Whatever fragile spell held the moment together. The German fighter escorted them north, Past cities, past gun emplacements, past patrol zones, Stigler watched every movement below, every shadow above. He stayed alert, ready to break away if another Luftwaffe pilot appeared. None did. Perhaps luck was on their side. Perhaps the sky itself was holding its breath as the coastline came into view. Stigler knew his time was almost up. Once the bomber reached open water, his protection would end. He could not cross the North Sea without drawing attention. He could not follow them home. He pulled slightly ahead of the B-17, then rolled his aircraft gently, exposing the black cross on his wings. A final warning. "This is as far as I go." Charlie Brown nodded, though he wasn't sure Stigler could see it. Then the German pilot saluted. A clean, formal gesture. Not to an enemy, to a fellow airman. Stigler banked away sharply, diving back toward Germany, leaving the battered bomber alone in the sky. Inside ye old pub, silence lingered. Then someone laughed. Not because it was funny. Because they were alive. The flight home was a blur of pain, cold, and exhaustion. The engines held together through sheer luck and stubbornness. When the bomber finally limped onto an Allied airfield, emergency crews swarmed it in disbelief. The aircraft was barely intact. The crew stumbled out, wounded, shaking, alive. Charlie Brown was debriefed immediately when intelligence officers asked him about the damage. The fighters, the flak, he answered honestly. When they asked how he escaped, he hesitated. Then he told them about the German pilot, about the escort, about the Mercy. The room went quiet. The officer leaned forward and spoke carefully. "You will not mention this to anyone else," Charlie frowned. "Sir, if word of this gets out," the officer continued, "someone will try to find that pilot. And if they do, he'll be dead." Charlie understood then. This story wasn't his to tell, not yet. Not for a long time. Back in Germany, Franz Stigler landed his aircraft and shut down the engine. He sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands resting on his knees, staring at nothing. He hadn't fired a shot. He hadn't claimed a victory. He had done something far more dangerous. He had chosen mercy, and in wartime Germany, mercy was treason. Stigler never spoke of that day. Not to his superiors, not to his comrades, not even to his closest friends. He carried it silently through the rest of the war, through defeat, through captivity. Through the long years after, for decades, the two men lived separate lives, bound by a moment neither could forget and neither could share. Enemies once, witnesses always, brothers though they did not yet know it. An unwritten rule of war **** war has rules. Some are written into manuals. Others are spoken in briefing rooms, reinforced by ranks and punishments. And then there are the rules that are never written down, rules passed quietly from one man to another, learned through blood, experience, and loss. Franz Stigler lived by one of those unwritten rules. He learned it long before December 1943, long before he ever saw a B-17 bleeding across the German sky. He learned it from his commanding officer, Gustav Redl, a veteran fighter pilot who believed that skill without honor was worthless. Redl taught his pilots that they were warriors, not murderers, that there was a difference between defeating an enemy and destroying a helpless man. "You shoot down planes," Redl had said. "You don't shoot down people." Those words stayed with Stigler long after Redl was gone. By late 1943, the war in the air had changed. Early optimism had been burned away by reality. Bombers came in larger formations now, fighters came faster and more aggressively. Casualties mounted on both sides. The Luftwaffe was losing experienced pilots faster than it could replace them. Young men were thrown into cockpits with minimal training. Expected to fight veterans who had been flying since the war began, survival had become its own moral compass, and yet, even in that brutal environment, certain lines still mattered. One of them was clear. You did not shoot down a defenseless aircraft. Not because it was forbidden by international law, though it often was, but because once you crossed that line, something inside you changed. Stigler knew that. As he flew back toward his base after escorting ye old pub to safety, his mind replayed the image again and again. The shattered nose, the wounded men, the way the American pilot had looked at him, not with hatred, not even with fear, but with stunned disbelief. Stigler didn't feel heroic. He felt exposed. Every decision in wartime carried weight. But this one carried consequences he couldn't predict. Had anyone seen him? Had anyone reported him? German radar stations tracked aircraft movements constantly. Ground crews noticed when planes returned without ammunition expended. Questions would come. They always did. When Stigler landed, mechanics approached his aircraft as usual. He climbed down without ceremony, removed his helmet, and handed it off. His face gave nothing away. Years of war had taught him how to keep his thoughts locked behind his eyes. A fellow pilot glanced at his plane. "Any luck up there?" Stigler shrugged. "Nothing worth reporting." That was enough. In wartime Germany, silence was often safer than truth. He walked away, boots crunching against frozen ground, heart still pounding. Only when he was alone did the tension release slightly. He leaned against a wall, closed his eyes, and exhaled slowly. He knew exactly what he had done, and he knew exactly what it could cost him back in England. Charlie Brown faced a different kind of silence. The official debriefing was thorough, clinical, and strangely detached. Intelligence officers documented damage, enemy formations, flak concentrations. Doctors tended to the wounded while scribes wrote notes that reduced terror to neat lines of text. When Charlie described the German fighter escort, the room shifted. No one interrupted him. No one asked questions right away. When he finished, the lead officer folded his hands and spoke carefully, choosing each word. "This did not happen," he said. Charlie stared at him. "Sir, it did." The officer met his eyes. "I'm saying it would be recorded." "Not officially." Another officer added, "If the Germans find out one of their pilots did this, they'll execute him." Charlie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "So what am I supposed to say? You say you escaped because of cloud cover, or confusion or luck? You say nothing else." Charlie nodded slowly. The truth, he realized, was dangerous not just to him, but to the man who had spared them, and so the story was buried. Official records showed ye old pub as heavily damaged, crew wounded. Aircraft miraculously returned. The rest disappeared into memory, carried only by 10 American airmen who owed their lives to an enemy they would never see again. Years passed. The war ended. Germany lay in ruins. The Luftwaffe was dismantled. Franz Stigler was taken prisoner, then eventually released. Like many former pilots, he struggled to find his place in a world that no longer needed men who knew how to kill at altitude. He emigrated, started over, built a new life far from Europe, far from the sky that had once defined him. And yet, no matter how many years passed, December 20th, 1943 never faded. Neither did it fade for Charlie Brown. He returned to civilian life, married, raised a family. He told war stories when asked about flak, about fear, about missions that blurred together in memory. But he never told that story. Not fully. Not publicly. It wasn't until decades later, when the weight of silence became heavier than the risk of truth, that Charlie began searching. He placed an ad in a veteran's newsletter, looking for the German pilot who spared my crew in December 1943. He didn't know if anyone would respond. Across the world, Franz Stigler read those words and felt time collapse in on itself. He knew immediately. He wrote back. When the two men finally met, it was not as enemies, not even as veterans of opposing sides. It was as men who had shared something rare in war, a moment of humanity. They talked for hours, then days. They compared memories, confirmed details, filled in the gaps of a story that had lived separately in their minds for 40 years. They laughed. They grew quiet. They became family. From that moment on, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler referred to each other not as former enemies, but as brothers. Their families blended, their lives intertwined. When one spoke, the other listened. When one passed away, the other mourned, because some bonds are forged not by shared cause, but by shared choice. In the end, the unwritten rule Franz Stigler followed mattered more than any medal he never received. And the silence Charlie Brown kept saved her life long after the war was over. War teaches men how to destroy, but once in a great while, it reveals who they truly are. Be escorted through hell at 12,000 feet over northern Germany. Survival was no longer a matter of strategy. It was a matter of minutes. Ye old pub staggered forward like a wounded animal, its engines uneven, its airframe trembling with every vibration. The aircraft was never meant to fly this low over enemy territory, not alone, not crippled, and certainly not without defensive firepower. Charlie Brown could feel the strain through the controls. Every adjustment required careful pressure. Too hard, and the plane might snap apart. Too gentle, and it would lose altitude it could not afford to lose behind him. The crew existed in a strange limbo between action and exhaustion. Wounded men were secured as best they could be. Blood-soaked bandages stiffen as they froze. Oxygen masks were passed round like lifelines, shared between men whose breaths came shallow and uneven. The bomber should have been dead 10 times over, and yet it kept flying outside. Franz Stigler maintained position of the bomber's wing, close enough to see the expressions inside. Close enough that a single lucky shot from either side could end him instantly. He had chosen mercy. Now, he had to survive it. German anti-aircraft batteries dotted the countryside below. Trained crews scanned the sky constantly, waiting for silhouettes that didn't belong. A lone bomber at low altitude was an irresistible target. Stigler adjusted his position, deliberately placing his fighter between the ground guns and the B-17. To anyone watching from below, it might appear that he was escorting a captured aircraft or preparing it for destruction. It was a dangerous illusion. One burst of friendly fire could shred his fighter. One radio call could bring other interceptors, screaming down on them both, inside his cockpit. Stigler kept his radio silent. Radio silence was suspicious, but speaking was worse. Charlie Brown noticed the flak bursts begin again. Closer now, sharper. The explosion sent shockwaves through the air, buffeting the already damaged bomber. He gritted his teeth and held course, trusting the German pilot beside him in a way that defied everything he had been taught. Trusting. The enemy was madness, but trusting him was keeping them alive. A flak burst detonated dangerously close to Stigler's fighter. Shrapnel rattled against his wings. He flinched but held position. He couldn't break away, not yet, if he left too soon. The bomber would be torn apart. Time slowed. Seconds stretched. Every mile north mattered. Below. Then, towns slid past. Church steeples. Roads filled with tiny moving dots. Smoke columns from factories still burning despite the bombing. This was the heart of Germany. This was the last place an American bomber should have been flying unchallenged. Inside ye old pub. Charlie felt the aircraft shudder violently. Engine 3's overheating. Someone shouted. Charlie adjusted the throttle, feathered the prop slightly. Coaxing the engine into cooperation. Sweat ran down his spine despite the freezing cold. He knew what was coming, if one more engine failed. They were done. Stigler saw the change instantly. He recognized the subtle yaw. The way the bomber struggled to maintain level flight. He edged closer, signaling again slow. Deliberate movements meant to calm rather than command. The message was simple. Hold on. Below them, a German flak position opened fire in earnest. Black bursts erupted ahead of the bomber's nose. Charlie swerved gently. Avoiding the densest clusters without stressing the airframe, Stigler mirrored the movement. Flying tighter now. Almost overlapping the bomber's path, a burst exploded between them for a split second. Charlie thought he had lost the German pilot. Then the fighter emerged from the smoke. Intact, Stigler exhaled slowly. He was flying on borrowed time. If another German pilot appeared, Stigler would have seconds to explain something that could not be explained. If he hesitated, both aircraft would die. If he attacked the other fighter to protect the bomber, there would be no justification, no defense. He had chosen mercy. Now, he was gambling his life on it. As they approached the coastline, the landscape changed. Rivers widened. The ground grew darker, wetter. The grey line of the North Sea appeared on the horizon like a promise and a threat all at once. Charlie Brown felt a surge of hope so sharp it hurt. If they could reach open water, they might make it. Stigler knew that too. He began to pull slightly ahead of the bomber, checking the sky one last time. No fighters, no interceptors, just cold air and distance. He rolled his aircraft gently, exposing the black cross on his wings clearly. A final signal. This is the edge. Charlie nodded. He wanted to say something. Anything. There were no words that could cross that distance. No signal that could carry gratitude or disbelief or relief. There was only the moment. Stigler saluted. A formal, unmistakable gesture. Then he banked hard to the left and dove away, disappearing back toward Germany, toward orders, toward consequences. Charlie watched him go until the fighter became a speck, and then nothing at all. The bomber crossed the coastline alone. The North Sea stretched beneath them, cold and unforgiving. If they ditched here, survival would be measured in minutes. Charlie adjusted course toward England, calculating fuel consumption, altitude, distance. Every number was tight, but possible. The flight back was agony. Engines coughed, instruments flickered. Men drifted in and out of consciousness. The bomber flew low, hugging the waves, invisible to radar over long stretches. Hours later, though it felt like days, the English coastline appeared. Charlie's hands were numb. His vision blurred from exhaustion. When the landing gear finally dropped and locked, he felt tears freeze on his cheeks. The landing was rough. The bomber slammed onto the runway, tires screaming, brakes protesting. The aircraft shuddered, then rolled to a stop. Silence, then movement, then shouting. Ground crews ran toward them. Stunned by what they saw, the B-17 looked like scrap metal held together by stubbornness and luck. The crew climbed out slowly, helped by medics, their faces pale, eyes hollow, alive. Charlie Brown stood on the tarmac and looked back at ye old pub. It should not have made it. They should not have made it. And somewhere across the sea, a German pilot was walking away from his aircraft, carrying a secret that could kill him if spoken aloud. War would go on. Bombs would fall. Men would die. But for one stretch of sky over northern Germany, hell had been held at bay by a single choice. Brothers, after the war ends on paper long before it ends inside the men who fought it. For Charlie Brown, the war ended in Europe in 1945. He took off his uniform, returned home, tried to build a life that made sense in a world that no longer required him to fly into gunfire. He married, worked, raised children, and learned how to speak about the war in safe, acceptable pieces. He talked about flak. He talked about fear. He talked about missions, but he did not talk about the German pilot. Not because he forgot, because remembering carried responsibility. Charlie understood, even as a young man, that the mercy he had been shown came with a cost. Somewhere in Germany, or perhaps somewhere far away by now, was a man who had broken the rules of war in the most dangerous way possible. By choosing not to kill, Charlie kept the story quiet out of respect and out of fear for the man who had saved them. Years passed, then decades. The world changed. Germany rebuilt. Enemies became allies. Former battlefields turned into quiet countryside. Still, the memory remained. For Franz Stigler, the war's end did not bring peace. Germany's defeat stripped away the structure that had defined his life. The Luftwaffe was gone. The skies were silent. The skills he had spent years perfecting were suddenly useless, even dangerous to admit. Like many former German pilots, he was viewed with suspicion, his past a burden he could not escape. He carried his own silence. He never spoke of December 20th, 1943, not to friends, not to family, not even to his wife. It was not guilt that kept him quiet. It was understanding. He knew that some acts, once exposed, became something else entirely. He had not saved those men for recognition. He had saved them because it was the only thing he could live with. Eventually, Franz Stigler left Europe behind. He emigrated to Canada, started a new life, built a business, and became a respected member of his community. To those who knew him, he was disciplined, quiet, thoughtful, a man who carried himself with restraint. Few suspected what he had done in the sky. Decades earlier, meanwhile, Charlie Brown grew older. With age came reflection, and with reflection came urgency. By the late 1980s, many of the men Charlie had flown with were gone. Some from age, some from illness, some from wounds that had never fully healed. He began to worry that the real story, would die with them. More importantly, he worried about something else. What if the German pilot believed his act had been forgotten? What if the man who had risked everything thought his mercy had vanished into silence? Charlie knew he couldn't let that happen. In 1988, more than 40 years after the war, Charlie placed a small notice in a veteran's publication. It was simple, careful, almost hesitant. Looking for the German pilot who spared my B-17 crew over Germany in December 1943. He did not expect a response, but across the world. Franz Stigler read those words and felt time collapse. He recognized the date instantly. He recognized the aircraft instantly. He recognized the moment instantly. There was no doubt. He wrote back. When Charlie received the letter, his hands shook. The handwriting was firm, deliberate. The words were direct. I was the pilot. They arranged to meet. The first meeting was quiet. There were no speeches, no dramatic gestures, just two old men standing across from each other, studying faces that had once been frozen behind goggles and glass. Charlie broke the silence. "Why didn't you shoot?" Stigler did not answer immediately. He looked down for a moment. Then back up. "I couldn't," he said. "You were already finished." That was enough. They talked for hours, then days. They compared memories, altitudes, damage, movements, piecing together the full picture for the first time. Each man filled in gaps the other had carried alone for decades. They discovered how close. Everything had come to disaster. How one radio call, one misinterpreted movement, one nervous flak gunner could have ended both their lives. They laughed at small details. They fell silent at others. What surprised them both was how quickly the past stopped feeling heavy. The story no longer belonged to one man carrying a secret. It belonged to two men sharing a truth. Their families met next, children and grandchildren. Listened as the story unfolded. Stunned that the person who should have been an enemy had become something else entirely. Franz Stigler was welcomed into Charlie Brown's family not as a former German pilot, but as the man who had given them a future. They called each other brothers, not as a metaphor, as fact. They visited each other regularly. They attended events together. They spoke publicly about the incident, carefully, respectfully, always emphasizing that the story was not about heroism. It was about choice. Franz Stigler never accepted praise easily. When people called him a hero, he corrected them. "I did what any decent man should do," he said. Charlie disagreed. He knew how rare that choice had been. As the years passed, their bond deepened. When Charlie's health declined, Franz was there. When Franz grew older and quieter, Charlie stayed close. They had shared a sky once. Now they shared time. In 2008, Franz Stigler passed away. Charlie Brown spoke at his memorial. "He was my brother," Charlie said simply, "not because we were alike, but because he showed me what kind of man I should try to be." Charlie would follow him just a few years later. Today, their story is taught in military academies, ethics courses, and history classrooms round the world, not as a lesson in strategy or tactics, but as a reminder that even in the most brutal conditions, humanity is a choice. War demands obedience. Honor demands judgment. And sometimes, the bravest act in combat is knowing when not to pull the trigger. High above Germany, in the winter of 1943, two men proved that enemies could still recognize each other as human beings. They were separated by uniforms, united by mercy, and bound for life.